All right, welcome back to our third review video on the good life. We'll be talking about the good life as moral virtue, or what we'll call moral perfectionism. Our first figure that we discussed who held this position was Aristotle, and we read Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 4, which contained his famous function argument. Before we got to the function argument, though, we saw that Aristotle draws a threefold distinction between ends or goals. He says this: we say that an end pursued in its own right is more complete than an end pursued because of something else, and that an end that is never choice-worthy because of something else is more complete than ends that are choice-worthy both in their own right and because of this end. Hence, an end that is always choice-worthy in its own right, never because of something else, is complete without qualification. So here we see Aristotle distinguishing between things that are, or ends that are, merely instrumentally good, choice-worthy or desirable only for the sake of other ends. We gave the example of money in class. He then has a category of intrinsic goods, and these are things that are desirable for their own sake. That is, we would choose them even if nothing else resulted from them, even if you couldn't get anything in addition to those ends, you would still choose them. But he says they're also choice-worthy for the sake of something else. And that thing for the sake of which even intrinsic ends are choice-worthy is the final end. And the final end is one that is desirable both for its own sake and not for the sake of anything else. So it's the kind of stopping point, the ultimate final end, for which all of our desires ultimately point, or towards which all of our desires ultimately point. And for the sake of that final end, we don't desire anything else. Aristotle says that our final end is eudaimonia, which, as we discussed in class, often is translated as happiness. The good life is really a better translation for it, I think, just because Aristotle definitely doesn't mean a feeling, like the feeling of joy or the feeling of happiness or the feeling of pleasure. Again, the good life may include moments of positive experience, like the feeling of happiness, but eudaimonia for Aristotle is sometimes called flourishing, or a well-lived human life. It's a quality of an entire, say, 70-year period in which one lives. So here you can see the structure of Aristotle's view of the sort of hierarchy of ends. We have the merely instrumental ends, the things we only choose for the sake of something else. So you've got money, you've got housing, you have a college degree, you have I don't know, certain foods, right? All of these things we choose for the sake of, say, pleasure or safety or an education or knowledge. But those things that I just listed, pleasure and knowledge, health, honor, beauty, maybe moral virtue, these things are worth choosing for their own sake. But we also choose them, Aristotle says, because they're key ingredients in a well-lived life. And so these things not only have value in and of themselves, but they also get us something, typically, if we don't have a disaster that strikes. If things go well for us and the world is sort of on our side and we get lucky, then the right arrangement of moral virtue, health, pleasure, beauty, knowledge across a life results in the well-lived human life. Okay, so that is the backdrop for Aristotle's function argument. We pick up with the function argument when Aristotle is essentially admitting that, look, I've identified the final end as eudaimonia, or happiness, but that's not super informative. After all, the hedonist agrees that happiness is the final end, is the thing that we're all after. But the hedonist thinks that happiness is best gotten, the well-lived life is best gotten by pursuing the life of maximal net pleasure. Aristotle doesn't think that. So he and the hedonist agree that happiness is the final end, but disagree about the nature of happiness. So what is Aristotle's view of the nature of happiness? And the view he wants to get you to by the end of the function argument is what we can call moral perfectionism. This is the view that the good or eudaimonic human life, or happiness, not understood as a feeling, but the well-lived life, is a life of full moral virtue. Full moral virtue. Here are some potential figures that might at least approach the kind of full moral virtue that Aristotle cared about and thought was constitutive of the good life. I will add that, Gandhi and MLK were both assassinated, MLK relatively young, and Aristotle thought that you can live an incredibly virtuous life, but if circumstances outside your control intervene and you, say, die young as a result of an assassination, for example, Aristotle cared a lot about death at sea for some reason, but the general principle holds that if you die in a way that isn't a sort of ideal way toward the end of your life when you're in old age, then you've been kind of robbed through no fault of your own of eudaimonia. So we didn't talk about this, but Aristotle is kind of what we can call externalist about happiness, in that it is not in the end ultimately under your control entirely. You can do your part and be as morally virtuous as possible, but sometimes the world doesn't cooperate. And when the world doesn't cooperate and you get unlucky, that can tragically rob you of a well-lived life. So why does Aristotle think that moral virtue is the key to the good life? After all, he thinks all kinds of things have intrinsic value. So why is he privileging moral virtue? And here, Aristotle's insight is, maybe when we're theorizing about what the good life for a human being is, we should start by asking, what sets us apart from other beings? What makes human beings special? What is, so to speak, our distinctive nature? And the way he puts this is, what is our characteristic function? He says this: but presumably the remark that the best good is happiness is apparently something generally agreed. Again, he and the hedonist agree on that much. And we still need a clearer statement of what the best good is. Perhaps then we shall find this good if we first grasp the function of a human being. So his argument for moral perfectionism begins with the thought that whatever the good life for a human is, it has something to do with the distinctive or characteristic function of a human. Because this is a review video, I'm just going to lay out the argument. I'm not going to walk through all of the passages where each of these premises come from, but I will, once I've walked through the steps briefly, I will just turn to the key defenses that we discussed, because you will need to know those. The first premise, Aristotle's first premise, is this: the good life is whatever life excellently fulfills the characteristic human function. We just saw that in that passage, this connection between a theory of the good life and whatever makes us special, something to do with that. FA2, the second premise, Aristotle gives us a specification of what the human function is. He says it's action or activity involving reason. So we'll come back to that in a second. It follows from 1 and 2, if the good life is whatever life excellently fulfills the characteristic human function. What's the characteristic human function? It's some action involving reason. It follows that the good life is the life of excellent action involving reason. The fourth step, once we have that intermediate conclusion that the good life is excellent action using reason, well, what does that mean? What does that look like across a life, to act excellently using reason? Aristotle says that is just what we mean by the life of moral virtue. To act excellently using reason across a life is just to be generous, to be brave, to be compassionate, and to manifest those dispositions in your actions. The fourth step builds the bridge between the life of moral virtue and the life of excellent action using reason. Those two are just the same. So says Aristotle. It follows that the good life is the life of moral virtue. Okay. The good life excellently fulfills the characteristic human function. It's whatever life that is. Why does Aristotle think this? We'll call this defense. This is the defense of the first premise. Really briefly, here's the relevant passage. He says, perhaps then we shall find this, that is the characteristic function, perhaps we shall find this, that is the final end for a human, or the best good, if we first grasp the function of a human being. For just as the good, that is doing well, for example, a flautist, or, for example, a sculptor, so that is a good sculptor, and every craftsman, that is a good craftsman of a particular type, and in general for whatever has a function and characteristic action, seems to depend on its function. So for anything whatsoever, if it has a function, then what's good or bad for it depends on its function. The same seems to be true for a human being, if a human being has some function. Now we say that the function of a kind of thing, of a harpist for instance, is the same in kind as the function of an excellent individual of that kind, of an excellent harpist for instance. So here, to simplify things, the way we're going to understand this is that Aristotle is tying together the notion of a characteristic function and the excellent performance of a function. So what we're looking for is not just the characteristic function of a human, but the kinds of characteristics that it would take to perform that function well. Obviously, something could perform a characteristic function, but do so very badly. So, for example, the characteristic function of a chair is to be sat upon. Some chairs fulfill that function very well by having stable legs, by having a supportive back, by having a relatively comfortable seat, maybe having wheels depending on what you want to use it for, in addition to seating yourself and where you want to use it. A chair that has those features is performing its characteristic function well, and it is therefore that which we call a good chair. Like when you're like, I want a good chair, what should I look for? You're looking for exactly those features that make for something, that help something perform the characteristic function of a chair well. On the other hand, something that has some but not all of those characteristics, maybe it's got sturdy legs but the back isn't supportive, or maybe one of the legs is broken, or maybe it's not completely broken but just weak, such that when you sit on it for the 5th time it'll fall over. Although there's a sense in which that object performs the characteristic function of a chair, it does not do so excellently. And that is a way for something, sorry, that's my clock, it sounds like a bird. That is a way for something to be a bad chair. So a good chair and a bad chair, what are those? Well, just the kinds of objects that have either the characteristics that allow it to perform the characteristic chair function excellently, or the characteristics that allow it to perform the characteristic function of a chair badly. That's what makes something a good or a bad chair. Aristotle thinks this is not just a truth about chairs, nor is it just a truth about like human-made artifacts. It's a very general truth. The good life or existence for things that aren't alive, or way of being, that is just its being or existence, for something of a kind K, that may be a chair, maybe a human, maybe a dog, for anything of any kind. The good for that kind of thing is just to excellently fulfill its characteristic function. So the good for a chair is just whatever allows it to fulfill the characteristic function of a chair. The good for a human, therefore, is whatever allows a human to excellently fulfill the characteristic human function. This principle, KR, I'm calling it kind relativity because what it means is that it doesn't make sense to ask, is this good or bad for something, full stop. You have to specify the kind of thing it is. What's good for my basset hound is not good for me. What's good for a chair is not good for me. What's good for me is not good for the chair. So good or bad is always, according to Aristotle, relative to a kind, and specifically determined by the characteristic function of the kind. The features that, the function that sets that kind apart from other kinds. So Aristotle says the characteristic function is action involving reason. That is his claim about what particularly the characteristic function is, of a human being is. We gave a process of elimination defense of this premise, basically following Aristotle's argument in the text. I won't turn to the text, but just walk through the argument briefly. His first step in defense of this claim that our function is action involving reason is that the characteristic function of a human is either being biologically alive or perceiving or an action involving reason or activity involving reason. So those are your three options. That's the first step. Second step, the characteristic function of a human is not biological life. Eliminate the first step. Why? Well, because oak trees are alive. And so what we're looking for is not just something we do, but something that sets us apart from other kinds of things. So because an oak tree is alive, the fact that I'm living, although is a function of mine, it's not my characteristically human function. Something else can do that too. Nor is my characteristic function, nor is yours, perceiving, sense perception, desiring, pleasure and pain. Those things, Aristotle rightly points out, non-human animals do those. So although those are things we do, they're not special to us. Instead, he says, therefore the characteristic function of a human is an activity involving reason. The only thing that remains is we don't just act on our perceptions, we don't just biologically live, we don't just breathe and have heartbeats. The thing that's unique about us is that we act in the world in a way that draws on this special faculty that we call reason. This faculty is what lets us do advanced mathematics. It's what lets us do philosophy. It's what lets us use language, sophisticated kinds of language that, although there may be primitive ways of, primitive forms of communication that we might loosely call language that some non-human animals engage in, the sort of language we have is a lot more sophisticated. That is the kind of faculty that Aristotle is interested in here. It's also the faculty that allows us to step back from our own desires and evaluate what we care about in the long term. So while when my dog feels hungry, then just is moved by his hunger to go get the food, if I feel hungry, I can, if I want to, step back and think, have I already had too much today? Or did I eat recently and should I hold off for a little bit until my partner gets home to have dinner together? Or if I get hungry for a piece of cake, I can think to myself, is that in my long-term health interests to have this cake? Or should I instead abstain and sort of allow myself to endure the hunger because I think it's better for the health of my body in the end? And then I can make a sort of free decision about what I care most about and which desire to act on. That ability to step back from one's own impulses and desires and emotions as well. I can feel angry but decide I'm not going to act on it. My dog doesn't do that. That ability is this action involving reason. It follows from these two that the good life is a life of excellent action involving reason. Here is the fourth step and the final step that needs explanation and defense. A life of excellent action involving reason, so says Aristotle, is the life of moral virtue. Why does he think this? Well, let's back up for a minute and think about what is a moral virtue anyway. In class, the way I put it is, what distinguishes a moral virtue from a one-off good action? So if you see somebody doing something generous, what else do you need to know about them to conclude not just that, oh, they did a generous action, but they are generous as a person. They're a generous person. They have that character trait. What else do you need to know other than just they did it once? One thing you need to know is, are they just literally just doing it once? Is this a one-off thing? Or are they doing it as a result of a habit they have of doing generous things in similar situations whenever the need arises? Because if it's the latter, then that counts in their favor toward being generous in addition to just doing a generous thing. So generosity, and indeed every virtue, seems to be a habit or a disposition to reliably behave in certain ways across situations. But also, in addition to just mere behaving in certain ways, we also think that in order for somebody to have a virtue, they have to be doing it for the right reasons. So somebody who reliably gives money whenever the opportunity arises, but always does it because they're trying to get the tax write-off, or they're trying to benefit themselves in some way, maybe by impressing somebody who's with them. The consistency alone is not enough. You also need to get inside their head to the extent you can and find out, what is their motivation? Is it because they feel compassion for the people who need the money and they feel that they can do some good? Or is it instead a less than praiseworthy reason, like I think I'm going to get a tax write-off if I put this in my tax form? So a moral virtue then is a habit or disposition to have the right feelings, that is, emotions and desires, and then to act according to those feelings. Okay? So remember, premise 4 says that the life of excellent action involving reason just is the life of moral virtue. So far, the word reason hasn't shown up in our definition of virtue. So we're still looking for, well, why is it that when you act with reason, you're going to be virtuous and vice versa? Where's the connection between virtue and reason? And the answer is, when we look at this word right, you have to have the right feelings, the right motives, the right desires, and then act on those in order to be generous or brave or compassionate, right? And the question of what are the right feelings to feel? What are the right desires to have? And so what are the right actions to do? Is something that, according to Aristotle, necessarily we have to use reason to determine. And that's where reason comes in. If you are using your reason to act well throughout your life, you will be thinking about the question of how much money should I give, if any, to whom? When should I stand up for my beliefs, and when should I, maybe when is it more prudent for me to remain silent? Okay, yes. So the question now is, okay, how do we determine what the right feeling is? And you guys didn't read this, but you should know generally this concept of the doctrine of the mean. Aristotle thinks the right feeling is always an intermediate or mean between two extremes, the extreme of excess and the extreme of deficiency. And his thought is that in order to determine what the mean between the two extremes is, how much fear should I feel when I see a mouse versus a bear? Or what should I do with that fear when I feel it? Should it cause me to flee? Or is this a circumstance where if my friend's in danger and we're hiking and there's a bear, we should stick together and I shouldn't just tear out of there recklessly? Those things, Aristotle thinks, are all going to require you to reason about what is good for you, what is good for the people you're with. And they're also always going to be an intermediate condition between the two extremes. So here's what he says. By virtue, I mean virtue of character. For this is about feelings and actions, and these admit of excess, deficiency, and an intermediate condition. We can be afraid, for instance, or be confident, or have appetites, or get angry, or feel pity, and in general have pleasures or pain, both too much and too little, and in both ways not well. But having these feelings at the right time, about the right things, toward the right people, and for the right end, and in the same way, and in the right way, is the intermediate and best condition, and this is proper to virtue. So we figure out what the mean amount is, or what the mean is between the two extremes of an emotion, how much fear, what kind of response it should bring about, when is running appropriate and when is it not. The only way to figure that out is to use your reason. And Aristotle has a kind of, I think, pretty realistic view about how complicated this is, right? So if you can go wrong with respect to a given emotion, like anger, in two different directions, there's actually more than that. But if too much anger is wrong and too little anger is wrong, it's a lot easier to get anger wrong than it is to get it right. The mean is a lot harder to hit. It's like doing archery and you've got a target. There's a lot of empty space compared to the very small target you're trying to hit. And this is why Aristotle thinks, we need to just try our best. And over time, if you're doing your level best, you'll be gaining experience and triangulating. You may find yourself in a slightly different place than someone else. Aristotle's not a relativist, so he thinks that there is a right answer to hard moral questions, but he also admits that they can be very difficult and perhaps even in certain circumstances unknowable. So he's very comfortable with the complexities of morality and the ability for human beings engaging their reason as best they can to come to slightly different conclusions about whether this is the time to fight or perhaps this is the time to live and live to fight another day. The big picture, though, is for Aristotle, you need to engage your reason in your action and in your feelings, and that's just what virtue is. Therefore, the good life is the life of moral virtue. So that was the function argument. I'm going to divide this video up into smaller pieces because there's a lot of material. The next one will be Mencius and